Strengthen your understanding of governance and policy design. The 12-week graduate course in public policy begins 10th January 2026. Apply by 30th November 2025 to avail a 10% early bird scholarship.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I am Bhumika Sevkani, a research analyst with the Indo-Pacific Studies program at the Takshashila Institution. And in today's episode, we will dive into a recent development in the Indian trading ecosystem. Recently, the government of India has revoked quality control orders on key industrial inputs. And to flesh out the details and its impacts, we have today with us Anisree Suresh, a research associate with the geoeconomics team at the Takshashila Institution. Welcome, Anisree.
Thank you, Bhumika.
So, Anisree, without taking up a lot of time, I'll throw out the question for you and let you explain us more about this particular measure, which is called Quality Control Orders, the QCOs.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned in our conversation that recently in November that the government of India revoked these QCOs on key industrial inputs such as aluminum, copper, nickel, PTA, MEG, polyester, fiber, yarn, etc. So, could you tell us a bit more about and give us the context of this overhaul and why this debate matters now?
Yeah. First of all, thanks a lot, Bhumika. And I think you kind of rightly set the context here. By revoking quality control orders on key industrial inputs items, and the items that you mentioned are and these are major intermediaries that play a crucial role in the various value chains or various industries of India, right? For example, you have copper and aluminum, quality controls of copper and aluminums were revoked. And you have certain chemical intermediaries that play a crucial role in the textile value chain, which one of our biggest exports, right? And the India government has begun a comprehensive overhaul of the standards framework in the last couple of weeks, right? So let's understand this. So this quality control orders or QCOs are the legal directives issued by the government ministries or departments under the Bureau of Indian Standards Act, BIS. So which requires products made or imported into India to meet a specific standard. So this overhaul is happening in the backdrop of an internal Niti Aayog report by a high-level committee headed by our former Cabinet Secretary Rajiv Gauba. So under this report, this report was not published. That's I couldn't find the report. But a lot of news reports came out after this committee meeting and everything. And basically it recommended that a majority of the QCOs cover raw materials and intermediate products in India. So that means most QCOs wrongly target raw materials and intermediaries, not really consumer facing finished good. Which again, we'll come back to that discussion later. But then, that's the recommendation of the Niti Aayog committee, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they say that this has created certain supply shortages, market concentration, and inflated domestic prices and everything. And if you actually look at it, between 2016 and 2025, the number of products brought under mandatory QCO coverage grew more than around 8 to 11 times, So, from having very fewer 70 QCOs in place, in 2016, now it grew to around 790 QCOs.
Oh,
That's a significant number, right? So, I think this is a quite important discussion. And I think especially in the background of the US tariffs and the emerging trends in the protectionism and all these things that's going around the world. I think this is with all the revoking of QCs, it's a good time to go back into this discussion and the discourse that's happening and revisit all these non-tariff barriers it's existing and see how India should strategize to maximize its export potential to achieve its goal of 8% economic growth.
Right. That was very interesting, Anisree. Thank you for fleshing out those details. It really sets out the context. But But before we dive into the impact of QCOs, can you break down quality control orders for us? So, what are quality control orders really, and how do we understand them as a regulatory tool, a safety measure, or an industrial policy instrument? And when the government created these QCOs, what did they hope to accomplish? What were the aims, and what were the stated objectives of it?
Yeah. So I think that's a very important part of this discussion, right? We have to understand, why this policy was designed, and to get a picture of, what are its stated objectives and where it stands. So that's a critical way to look at it. So, basically QCO, so the quality control orders, are mandatory technical regulation under the Bureau of Indian Standards Act. So basically requiring products manufactured in India or imported from elsewhere to conform to Indian standards. So that's what BIS stands for, right? So in principle, so I do want to highlight, in principle, what it means is a QCO should be issued only when either you have buyers cannot determine the product quality, or you have a situation where poor quality poses significant safety or environmental risk. So that time the standard is mattered a lot there. And also when there is a demonstrable public health, safety, or environmental justification to such kind of a QCO. And but if you look at it historically, India's journey with this mandatory product certification through quality control orders, it predates even the enactment of the BIS Act, which came in 1986. So we have some of the earliest regulations involving the Indian Standards Institution. You must have heard of ISI, we talk about ISI, right? So that was the earliest regulations involving the Indian standards and everything. So that was the predecessor of BIS itself. And that was mostly concerned with initially LPG cylinders, steel tubes, and cement and everything. You see that, okay, this has ISI mark and all these things. So that's the standard that we used it. And these were issued under other laws such as the Explosives Acts and the Essential Commodities Act of 1955 and everything. And then you have in 1986 BIS coming into picture. And one thing that you have to look at is BIS is not under Ministry of Commerce. It comes under the Ministry of Consumer Affairs. Oh. Okay, so it's the purpose objective is very clear, right? It's supposed to look at the quality of the product and but eventually what it has become is, it became a defensive trade tool, right? It's a trade tool. So it's not it has the evolution is that way, that it became a defensive trade tool than looking at the quality of the product. And while QCOs are most of the time notified by ministries and everything, it's usually administered by the BIS, okay, Bureau of Indian Standards. So it's very important to look at it from an Indian context too. BIS handles a kind of it does conformity assessment, it does factory audits, it does the testing and marking and enforcement and surveillance. So it has basically a kind of a dual role as an issuer of certificates, licenses and everything, and also as an enforcer. So this is where it gets a lot of global attention and a lot of criticism, and it's questioned globally in a sense that, especially in trade negotiations, and I think we'll come back to this point later in our conversation. Basically, it's questioned because of the fact that how can you do both? You're also issuer, you're also the enforcer. So that creates certain kind of prospects for rent-seeking behavior and all those things, right? So we'll come back to that point later. But that's one of the reasons why it was questioned. And also you have to look at it from an Indian perspective. Do we have the state capacity to administer these many quality control? I mean, okay, we'll come back to the discussion. That's for later. However, now, the overall objective that we have to understand here is QCO is increasingly used as a trade tool. It's used as a non-tariff barriers, and most of our trading nations also feel that. That's the most important fact here. And like I mentioned in the beginning, there is a noticeable trend in the sharp increase in the QCOs that we put out, so which fall under the ambit of the non-tariff measures, right? It's a non-tariff barriers for other countries to get market access in India and everything. Since 2019, the number of QCOs it's now it has that time we had around 70s. Now it reached around 765 by 2024, and more are coming like that, right? So while the overarching objective of QCOs is to ensure that imported products comply with the domestic technical regulation, and this has certain kind of like WTO has certain kindly allowed it, for member countries to introduce technical barriers and standards to regulate imported products to protect public health, the environment, etc. And it's been widely used by almost every country as well. We have to give that. However, we have to look at while the objectives are this, whether they are actually getting that effect. And in my opinion, the effects are completely opposite. It's negative.
Right. No, that's interesting. So this really highlights the gap between the initial aim of this body and how over time policymakers sort of use it for different purposes. And also how you mentioned this classic issue of merging both steering and rowing functions in one organization.
Yeah.
But moving on, so beyond their stated goals, how have QCOs played out on the ground? So what unintended consequences have emerged from them, particularly for Indian industries in sectors like metals, electronics, machinery, textiles, and chemicals, which widely saw the imposition of QCOs, right?
Yeah. So going back to the Nidhi Aayog committee, so many of the news reports that came out after that, so they say that Nidhi Aayog and the committee that particularly looked into it pointed out that so due to challenges faced by global suppliers in obtaining this BIS certification, the implementation of QCOs has in effect led to greater concentration among domestic suppliers in some sectors, giving them the ability to raise prices above global levels. So what it means is that you have QCOs, so that means it's a protectionist measure. So many countries who might want to sell their products in India, and you have the domestic competitors for that product, right? So QCO act as a barrier especially for our applying from outside, in a sense that because it's very difficult for them to get the license approval, the permit, whatever that has to be done with the BIS, right? From an external perspective, who is going to visit their factories from India and give the approval and all those things. So it creates delays, it creates a lot of procurement challenges and all those things, and that acts as a protectionist measures against protect Indian domestic industry. But if you look at it, Indian domestic industries as well, it is also adding a compliance cost for Indian domestic, because they also have to get that, they have to meet the quality regulation, and they have to ensure that, okay, these people are coming and doing the inspection and everything, getting the permits as they need it. And so it's also acting as a barrier for the Indian players as well. And it disproportionately affects the smaller firms than the larger firms, because this adds a compliance cost. They have to ensure that they regularly meet these standards and all those things. And that means the compliance cost of these smaller firms also goes up. And they are disproportionately affected by this as well. So what it largely, if you're looking at the unintended consequences of this policy, so one, when the prices are above global prices, since you have a compliance cost, so that adds up your manufacturing cost of your products. And sometimes you have mostly you have a lot of QCOs for the raw materials and intermediary product than the finished good. So that means all these products add up to your final cost, right? So that means your prices are most of the time above the average global prices. And we have a lot of competitors when it comes to global markets. For example, if you're looking at textiles, Bangladesh, you have Vietnam, you have all these countries competing for the same markets. So price matters a lot in those markets. So that means our global competitiveness is quite affected here. And then so for example, if you look at polyester fiber, yarn, and some of the steel products, they command over 15 to 30% price premiums over the global benchmarks. So already our competitiveness is highly affected by that. And if you're again going back to the point, a majority of QCOs are impacting raw materials, intermediates, and or capital goods rather than the finished consumer product. Again, finished consumer product is not the solution here, but the fact that all these raw products add up to the final product. And the committee itself, the Nidhi Aayog committee itself, found that India's rapid expansion of QCOs in the last couple of years, though aimed at improving quality, had led to supply shortages, higher input cost, and long certification delays, especially for MSMEs and all the small firms and everything. And most of the time they found that the QCOs that are being imposed cover certain raw material that pose no direct safety or environmental risk, making such regulation completely unnecessary, right? So the committee itself noted that most countries use voluntary or buyer-based standards, while India's overregulation has distorted manufacturing and trade efficiency. So, for example, once the end product is BIS certified, still you require separate approval for each input adds cost, in the sense you require approvals for the each input, it's especially if that raw material has a QCO on it, in that sense, right? So what it does is it adds cost, it delays the process. So and India's bureaucracy works in its own so all these things really affect India's export competitiveness. So when we talk about 8% growth, India has to have these many million economy and all those things. And we do how do we achieve that? We need the exports to work well, right? That's one of the major factors that we. But then the very objective of building India's all this QCOs comes into picture on the backdrop of you have Make in India. We want to boost our domestic industries and all those things. But it works exactly against that stated objective of these policies. So that's where it gets really tricky, right? And if you look at it, most of the time, all this, what it causes is it causes slower production and it increases the prices, especially in the global market. And whether it's actually improving the safety or quality, we're not sure. Yeah, because the very important factor that we have to look at is this: the top 5 sectors that are being affected by this QCOs are metals, machinery, electronics, textiles, chemicals, and plastics and rubber. Are actually the sectors we have certain global competitiveness. So that's you're killing the very factor of the economy that might be the reason we get the boost in the global markets and everything. And then I think I know I'm taking quite a lot of time, but it's a very interesting factor here. There's also implementation challenges and like I mentioned, you have certificate requirements, and that means you need the BIS also should have the state capacity to have that kind of testing labs and whether they have enough inspectors to go around do the QCO, whether it's being implemented properly or anything. So, but that means but does India has that? Not really, right? If lab capacity is constrained, that means there is a backlogs in certifications and all those things. And in extreme cases, that what it leads to is concentrated certification supply that probably would create quasi monopolies or rent opportunities, rent seeking opportunities and all those things. And that's not what you want. And you don't want to create that kind of government failures in a market, right? And it also raises entry cost for newer for players to come into the picture as well. And yeah, I mean, that's the... So, and the larger impact is QCO can cause product availability issues and may lead to higher cost for consumers.
No, that was a really detailed sort of explanation, and I'm glad it clears out a lot of things for our listeners as well. So just to sum it up, the QCOs eventually end up creating issues with ease of doing business and, of course, hampering our price competitiveness in the very sectors that are essential for sort of that have some sort of export potential and that are essential for this economic growth, right?
Yes.
So, but let's see. Let's now discuss on what can be done ahead. What could be the policy pathways? Are revoking the QCOs the right way to go about it? Should more products see this sort of a step? Since you mentioned that there were about 790, the list had increased to 790, right? And for now, it has only been very few numbers of products has seen this revocation.
So this is 790 is basically the QCOs covering the products, in the sense you have 790 products that being under the coverage of QCOs, which is huge.
Yes. So what would you recommend going ahead? Would you recommend a complete overhaul of QCOs or let's say protecting some, but...
Yeah. So I think I again go back to the Niti Aayog committee report itself. So basically a lot of the report that came out after the meeting was said that the committee recommended a major overhaul of the QCO regime itself. So it suggested that some action has to be taken on 200 and something QCOs, basically revoking around 27, suspend a lot, like 100 something QCOs, and they are also recommended we need to defer 69 plus QCOs as well. So it also urged that government has to scrap the steel import monitoring system, SIMS, and the steel ministry's no objection certificate rules. Because I'm not getting it again, another important discussion on non-tariff barriers and how that really stops. So that's another discussion that we can come back to later. And it also said we have to pause all upcoming QCOs until reviewed by an interministerial group and shift towards more voluntary or buyer-based standards aligned with global norms. So this is a very crucial point, and I really loved how the committee has put it up. So if you look at it US and UK, so I haven't studied much about their system, but they mostly have a voluntary based standard norm setter, right? So what it does is it kind of looks into the industry players and the industry itself develops a certain kind of standards, and the whoever is coming and joining into that industry, they also okay, this is the standard being set by our peers, and they eventually follow, and that becomes a global norm setter, right? I think, which is very interesting, as an economy, as an industry develops, this happens most of it. I mean, sometimes we might need government intervention. I'm not saying that completely you can leave the quality out of the picture. Like I said, in principle, if there is a safety, health hazard, or an environmental hazard that really needs government interventions, yes, that's where we need the standards being set.
Yep.
But but again, I think one thing we have to really comment that in the last 2 weeks, government has withdrawn QCOs on some 20 major industrial inputs across the textiles, and I think some in the plastics and the mining sectors, especially I think around November 13th, those weeks. And so especially the rollback removes this mandatory BIS certification for some products and textiles, polyester fiber, polyester yarn, like you mentioned earlier. And so I think that's very commentable. That's really good. I think we are really on a right track, especially if you're looking at a possible trade deal with the US. These are something that they raised as a concern, that India has a lot of non-tariff barriers. And non-tariff barriers are actually more critical and scarier than the tariffs itself. Yeah. So I think another issue here is also a recurring issue that undermines the credibility and international utility of India's QCO regime is that the lack of global acceptance of BIS. Okay. So when BIS laboratories are accredited, it recognizes only accredited labs for most certification activities. In the case of gold hallmarking and key export relevant sectors, BIS opted not to mandate accreditation for assigned centers. So we have a deviation from international practices, which typically relies on ISO, IEC accredited labs, and has contributed to the hallmarking system being unacceptable to the foreign market. So what is we lack of our accreditation to international and global norms isolates Indian conformity assessment system for the international system, but also prevents us from being part of this mutual recognition agreements, which are key part of our free trade agreements with a lot of trading nations, right? Especially with the United States, United Kingdom, and so what is what it happens, Indian exporters have to duplicate testing. Okay, they have to duplicate testing and certification abroad as well. They have to, if they want to sell it in India, they have to meet the BIS standards. And since the global standards are sometimes quite different from BIS, then they also have to get the certificate and the approvals from the global international standards as well. That's the only way you would be able to export. So this is actually an extra compliance, cost, effort, everything on exporters, right? And they are the key pillar of our economy as well. So I think that's especially this duplication efforts that the Indian exporters has to put for. Like especially like you see that a lot happening for gold, toys, and electrical goods related expos and everything. So suggestion is like one, like the committee recommended, let's go for more voluntary standards. Let's have a lot of like industry stakeholders, like taking a note on like whether we need a quality setter here or not. And I think the overarching point that I want to highlight here is like so when QCO is used as a defensive trade tool, this overregulation or like poorly designed QCOs may hurt domestic producers more than importers, like whoever is importing to India. And it will also negatively impact our trade relations with other countries, especially when the partners perceives QCOs as a non-tariff barriers rather than a genuine consumer protection measures. And yeah, that's what I want to highlight.
No, that the last highlight on the consequences on foreign trade relations and the unintended consequences overall that you mentioned, I think that really helps us understand the significance of taking this trend of revoking QCOs forward in the Indian trading ecosystem, right? So, yes, Anisree, thank you. Thank you so much for that explanation and also your recommendations. I think that significantly, I hope this helps our listeners understand this concept and provides a different perspective for them. So thank you, Anisree, and thank you for our listeners to joining in. Stay tuned for the next episode.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.